Welcome to the penultimate session of Zephaniah. One of the things I really like about this session is that, generally speaking, it is the darkest before the dawn. And so we're going to be looking at some of the really darkest oracles here, and then we're going to transition into the dawn, into the light, the oracles of restoration. So today's lecture is we're going to look at the oracle against the oppressive city, followed by the final oracle of Yahweh's day that I've titled The Catch, and then two oracles of restoration. One oracle about pagan transformation, followed by an oracle about the transformation of Judah. So the oracle against the oppressive city. This is an oracle of judgment against an unnamed city, but the context clearly indicates Jerusalem. It looks like any other oracle of execration against other nations. Why is that? Well, I think it has a rhetorical effect. By ending all those oracles of execrations against the other nations with an oracle of judgment against Judah, this has the effect of gathering all the people's approval about how bad all those other people are, just in time to aim that judgment back on its approving audience and say, look at you now. You're not so great, are you? Oh no, she is defiant and defiled, the city, the oppressor. So we can see that this oracle opens with that independent interjection, hoy, that we saw before. Hoy, oh no, yikes, danger, alas, woe. And this oracle then continues into this little phrase here that has a lot of wonderful cadence and alliteration. Morah v'nigalah. She is defiant and defiled. I have translated it to capture that cadence and alliteration. And here we find a name pun. Remember last week when we were looking at the oracles of execration against the nations, we saw a lot of name puns, a lot of cities that were called something that was similar to the sound of the name or the meaning of the name or something like that, right? Well, now we see it again in this oracle of judgment against Judah. Judah is called Morah, she who is rebellious, or she who is defiant. This is where the pun comes in. Do you remember the name of the hill on which Jerusalem is supposed to be built? It's called, in English, Moriah, right? So in Hebrew, Moriah is Moriah. Moriah, or Moriah, probably means something like the fear of Yah. So here we have a pun on that name. Instead of being Moriah, she is now Morah. Instead of the fear of Yah, she is rebellious or defiant. And so through a name pun, her very nature, Jerusalem's very nature, has been changed from one who fears God to one who rebels against God. And there's a little bit of irony in that as well, because if you remember from Genesis 22, Abraham's offspring was saved from being sacrificed on Moriah. But now, on that very same hill, according to the oracle of Yahweh's day, the sacrifice, 1:7, this very same hill is where she is going to be sacrificed. So, being saved from sacrifice on Moriah, becoming sacrificed on Morah. Shockingly, we can actually read this exact same verse positively. She who is revered and redeemed, the city, the dove. How is that? How could you possibly read this verse in two completely different ways, both very positive and very negative? Well, I'll give you one example here from the end. The city, the dove. The very last part here in the Hebrew is a feminine singular participle, hayonah. It means the oppressor. However, you could, instead of reading it as a feminine singular participle, hayonah, you could take it as the noun hayonah, which means the dove or the pigeon. So the exact same word could mean something very positive or very negative. We're not going to take it in a positive way tonight because there's a lot of reasons why it shouldn't be read that way. First of all, it starts off with this independent interjection of dismay, of lament, right? Oh no, hoy. Everything that follows this is negative. And what follows also helps to explain what was meant at the beginning in this verse. And then all the positive oracles are clumped together. You know, the oracles of restoration are all positive and they all appear together in Zephaniah, and this isn't clumped together with them. So we can be pretty certain that we're not supposed to read it as she who is revered and redeemed, the city, the dove. You can translate the exact same sentence both ways. Yes. That is weird, isn't it? All right, so how is the city defiant, defiled, and oppressive? Well, she is defiant because she listens not to the message. She receives not correction. And Yahweh she trusts not before her God is not present. So here we have a bunch of verbs: listens, receives, trusts, is not present. These verbs signify habitual or recurrent actions. This is not something the city did. It's not that she listened not to the message. It's not that she received not correction, etc. This is something that the city does. It characterizes her. And then she listens not to the message. Literally, this says the voice. But it's short for something like the voice of the prophet or the voice of Yahweh. In other words, the message. She listens not to the oracle. She listens not to the message. If you read some other translations, you'll see stuff like here in the ESV, she listens to no voice, as if she weren't listening to anyone. But that's not the point. It's not that she's deaf or just doesn't want to listen to anyone. The point is she doesn't want to listen to Yahweh, right? She receives not the message from Yahweh. She receives not his correction, etc. Question. Maybe I didn't say who was speaking here. Yeah, so, it looks to me like it's in the prophet's voice here, right? Because in Yahweh she trusts not. And then we have this word correction, which in the Hebrew is musar. In wisdom literature, it means teaching or instruction. Maybe in a positive sense. It can also have a negative sense like example, lesson, or warning. In prophetic literature, however, the entire phrase to receive correction or to receive not musar involves discipline meant to deter action. In other words, the people reject Yahweh's discipline or correction. So this is not to be taken positively. And then before her God, she is not present. Here we see that thematic root karav again. We also see it connected with the particle el, which means to or toward, usually. And when these two words are used together with something like the phrase the voice or something like that, it often has to do with hearing the deity's oracle. So you see an example of this from Isaiah 48:16. Yahweh commands his audience to draw near to him to hear his words. So I think we have good reason to believe that when it says before her God is not present, it's using this kind of sense. That is, she's not coming to God to listen to what God has to say through his prophets. So the oracle also says that she is oppressive. How so? Her princes are in her presence, lions roaring. Her judges, wolves of evening that disperse not by the morn. Again, we see that this oracle starts off by blaming the princes. We saw that before in 1:8. The princes, the leaders, or the major authorities and powers are named first, are condemned first in several of these Zephaniah oracles. In her presence, lions roaring. We see that thematic root again. And we have this phrase, lions roaring, or perhaps roaring lions if you prefer. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to have a roaring lion, especially if you have enemies coming against you. The point here, especially when it's linked with that thematic root karav, is that they are lions that are roaring at her, in her presence, within her. In other words, Jerusalem's leaders are predatory animals towards her. They treat their own people like prey. And we have another predatory metaphor here with her judges are wolves of evening. Judges are supposed to establish and maintain justice, but instead, here in Zephaniah, they're termed wolves that disperse not by the morn. This phrase, in particular, has caused people headaches for centuries. If you read the King James Version, it says, they gnaw not the bones till the morrow. The NASB says, they leave nothing for the morning. What is going on? So this is the verb garam. It appears only 2 other times in the Hebrew Bible. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at its usage in those 2 other places so we can better understand how it probably functions here in Zephaniah. So this is from Numbers. He, that is God, devours nations that oppose him. Yes, their bones, or their limbs, he garams, and their arrows he shatters. So because this verse mentions God devouring his enemies, interpreters usually suppose that garam must be related to eating. So that's usually where most of them get the idea that this means to gnaw. By looking closely at the structure, however, you can see that something else is going on here. Their bones or their limbs is parallel to their arrows, and he garams is parallel to he shatters or breaks apart. The parallel structure seems to indicate that garam is something like to break apart or to separate. And so the way I've translated it in Numbers is, yes, their bones or limbs he dismembers, and their arrows he shatters. And Ezekiel 24:34 also uses this verb. It starts by describing a cup of desolation. It then describes in the next verse what the people will do with this cup of desolation. You will drink it and drain it. Then your pottery you will garam, and your breasts you will shred. So, if you look at your translations in that verse, you will see they also treat garam as to gnaw. The idea being apparently that they're supposed to gnaw on the pottery from the cup of desolation, and after that, for some reason, shred their breasts. But again, I think if we look at the parallel structure, we can see better what's going on. Your pottery is parallel to your breasts, and you will garam is parallel to you will shred. So the implication, I think, is that she will shred her breasts with broken pieces of the pottery cup, with the broken pieces of the cup of desolation. And actually, the KJV seems to get it right this time. It agrees with me. It says, thou shalt break the sherds thereof. So the KJV actually translates garam as break in this one place, even though in all the other places it thinks that you're chewing on something. So going back to the oracle here. Her judges, wolves of evening, that disperse not by the morn. In Numbers and Ezekiel, garam is transitive. That means the subject acts upon an object. In those verses, you can see that there are objects that receive the action of the garamming. Here, the verb is intransitive. There is no object to act upon. The action is performed without an object. So, if the transitive meaning is to break apart or separate a thing, the intransitive meaning is simply to break apart or to separate. And so that's how I come up with her judges, wolves of evening, that disperse not by the morn. So what does that mean? Unlike wolves that prowl in the dark but scatter when dawn comes so that they won't be caught, I think this is saying that Jerusalem's judges attack people in broad daylight. They're worse than wolves of evening. And I think this also ties into something that we're going to see in the next couple verses, where Yahweh does something in the daylight that's very different. We also saw that she is defiled. How is she defiled? Her prophets are shifty, men of treachery. Her priests desecrate what is holy. They violate Yahweh's directive. So the next group to be condemned after the princes are the prophets. They are called treacherous and shifty. And shifty, that word there, describes a shift from the proper or expected course. So, for instance, in Genesis 49:4, water is described this way. And in Judges, you also see men described this way when they turn against their own people. Jeremiah 23:32 uses this word in parallel with the word lies, indicating that they are words that have shifted from what is true. And perhaps there's something about deception here, too, with her prophets. The final group to be condemned in this oracle are priests. Priests are also the final ones condemned by the deity in the oracle of cataclysm that began Zephaniah. So the question I have is, why does the list of sinners again lead to and end with priests? And my suggestion is because Zephaniah either was a priest and or was speaking to priests in the temple. So, what are the priests doing? They are accused of desecrating, defiling, or profaning, whichever word you prefer, what is holy, and doing violence or violating the directive of Yahweh. The word directive there is Torah, which doesn't have the connotations that the word Torah has today. Back in that time, there wasn't a canon. The Mosaic Law hadn't been put together in the way that we have it now. So back in Zephaniah's time, when it says Torah, it probably refers to the sacred statutes of the priestly order, what the priests are supposed to be doing, which you can read a lot of in Leviticus, to separate, to distinguish between the holy and profane, for example. If you look at your translations, you'll see that they don't quite match up with mine. Those other translations usually end with directive and begin the next verse with the divine name Yahweh, or perhaps you see Lord there in all caps. So why is that? Well, that's because the text as we have it actually ends verse 4 with directive and begins verse 5 with the divine name Yahweh. The medieval scribes actually put some markings in the manuscripts that said that after directive, you're supposed to end that verse, and with the divine name, you're supposed to begin the next verse. So for me to translate this, violate Yahweh's directive, I must actually make a slight alteration to the text in order to read it that way. But I have some good reasons. Ezekiel 22:26 quotes from and expands on this verse. In fact, Ezekiel 22 quotes from and expands on several verses in this particular oracle. And in that text, Yahweh speaks and says, my directive, which makes it quite literally Yahweh's directive. And the form of the word directive in Ezekiel 22:26 is exactly the form it would have to be if Yahweh were linked with directive in this verse. Contrary to virtually all translations out there, there is no the here. It does not say they violate the law or the directive or the Torah. Directive is indefinite. It says they violate a directive, or simply they violate instruction. Only by linking the word directive with the divine name does that word become definite. So the fact that all your translations say the directive or the law or the instruction means actually that they agree with me, that there is something definite about this word and that this word pertains to the name that comes after it. What is right is present to her. One must not do wrong. 3:5. What is right? If one does not move the divine name to the end of the previous verse, you have three options here at the beginning of the next verse. You could treat the word right, tzaddik, as an adjective for the deity. So this could be saying just upright Yahweh is present to her. Or you could treat the divine name and tzaddik as existing in apposition to one another. In other words, it would be saying Yahweh, the just one, or Yahweh, the upright one, is present to her. And finally, you could take it as a vocative. O Yahweh, the just one, is present to her. What it does not mean, what it cannot say, is what you have in your translations, which is Yahweh is just or upright. Why can it not say that? Because that is a different syntactic construction. In Hebrew, if you wanted to say Yahweh is just or upright, you would start with tzaddik and then go Yahweh. But in your Bibles, in your texts, it goes Yahweh, tzaddik. So, in other words, all your translations are choosing to read against the text anyway. So, if you're going to go with someone who's reading against the text, I think you should go with me, because I have some very good reasons for doing so. So we're going to proceed here as if the divine name belongs to the end of the previous verse. What is right is present to her. So this verse reuses concepts from the plea. The first is right behavior or justice. Seek what is right. How can they seek what is right unless it is present to her? We have that root karav again. So the question that probably comes to you is, what is the issue that is presently being communicated? One must not do wrong. There's actually two different ways to read this. Either he will not do wrong, referring to God, or one must not do wrong, being some sort of command or directive from God. So most of your translations will treat it as if it's referring to God. He will not do wrong. So my question is, what is it really trying to say? What is it that the people need to know? Do the people need to know that their deity is not going to mistreat them? Is that the reason for this statement in this oracle? Or is it because the people are doing wrong and they need to know that they're supposed to stop doing wrong. So depending how you answer that question will help determine how you translate the text. And we actually see in an oracle we looked at before what the prophet thinks about how people think about Yahweh. We saw in 2:12, those who think to themselves, Yahweh brings neither benefit nor detriment. You could also translate that something like, Yahweh brings neither good nor evil, or Yahweh brings neither wrong or right. In other words, the people don't think that Yahweh cares what they do and isn't going to do anything about their behavior. Right? So this seems to be the perspective that the prophet has about the people. Nowhere in Zephaniah's oracles are we told that the people think that Yahweh is going to act wrongly towards them. And then we also see in 3:13 the exact same language is used to describe the Israelites. It says that the Israelites will eventually do no wrong. So the problem being addressed there is that they are doing wrong. So they need to be told here not to do wrong. And this is the point of all these prophetic oracles, right? To address the people's wrongdoing. So I think we have a lot of good reasons to see this as reflecting what someone should do and not whether God is or is not going to behave wrongly. Morning by morning his demand emanates as a light never failing, yet the wrongdoer ignores reproach. Again, this is reusing concepts from the plea. His demand. We saw this in 2:3. Whatever his demand, do. His demand emanates as a light never failing. Most people take the deity as the subject of this verb to emanate and demand as the object. In other words, he gives his demand as a light. Now, this is quite possible. You could read it that way. There's not a lot of good arguments against reading it that way. I think demand is probably the subject here, because demand is used with this verb in other places, like in Hosea 6:5. Your demands are an emanating light. So that's what I'm going to go with here. As a light never failing. Now this verb either refers to Yahweh or it refers to the light. Literally, he is never lost, lacking, or missing, or it is never lost, lacking, or missing. So again, what do the Israelites, what do the people of Judah and Jerusalem need to hear? That God is never missing? I think that the light is the subject here. That's the light that is never failing or never lost or lacking. And this creates a wonderful simile in which the prophetic revelation is likened to the light of dawn. Yet the wrongdoer ignores reproach. This is typically translated, the unjust knows no shame. To not know means in this context to purposely pay no attention. So we see the same idea that began the oracle. She listens not to the message. She receives not correction. Remember, this is not about her not listening to anyone. This is about her refusing to listen. So by ignoring reproach, this oracle begins and ends with the same idea. So in conclusion, we see that the city is rebellious, defiled, and oppressive. Her princes and judges stalk their people like prey. Her prophets are false. Her priests are corrupt. Yahweh continually tells them to do what is right, but they refuse to listen and disregard his rebuke. So what does this tell us about God and what he wants from us and from our society? He wants closeness between us and him, and he wants right dealings between each other. And finally, the last oracle of judgment, the catch. This is the final oracle of Yahweh's day. This one is entirely in the deity's voice, and like the previous oracle, it reuses a lot of language from the other oracles. I eradicated nations. Reduced to ash are their corners. I devastated their roads. Vacant is the wayfarer. So we can see that this oracle opens with the verb to eradicate, which is the same verb that we saw in the very beginning of Zephaniah, the oracle of cataclysm, 1:3 and 1:4. The form of the verb there, however, indicated intent. I plan to, I intend to, I want to. The form here indicates completion. I did, I eradicated, I reduced, I devastated. And so really? Did all this already happen? Well, probably not, right? I mean, we talked last week about how some of these nations that Zephaniah was speaking against actually didn't fall until Babylon came along and drove them away. So that probably would have happened about the same time as it happened to Judah and Jerusalem, and maybe even afterwards, right? So I'm thinking that maybe these verbs are what some people call a prophetic perfect. That is, they are referring to a future reality as if it were already present. And then we have this verb to reduce to ash here. The same root we saw several times in the oracles against the nations, 2:4, 2:9, and 2:13. So in other words, Jerusalem is now going to share in the same doomed status as the other nations around it. And then you have their corners and the wayfarer. We saw the same metaphor in 1:16, where a corner refers to a person or people of permanence and importance. And here we actually have a very fascinating merism, because the person of permanence, the corner, is tied in with the wayfarer, the person of impermanence, the person of transience. So together they indicate nobody from the person that's been here forever to the person that might be passing through is going to be left. Yeah, so merism, that's like in Genesis when it says God created the heavens and the earth. So it takes these two polar opposites and combines them together to indicate a totality, right? In other words, God created everything, right? I eradicated nations. I devastated their roads. So how are we supposed to understand this verb to devastate? Well, it could also mean to desiccate, which means to dry up. So here again, by turning to the parallelism, I think you can get a better understanding of what's going on here. To dry up doesn't have much to do with to eradicate, so it probably means to devastate. Destroyed are their cities, vacant of person, void of populace. So destroyed. Here we have what looks to be the verb tzada, which means to intend or premeditate harm. Sometimes your translations will render it to lie in wait. The passive form that seems to be in this text would indicate their cities are premeditated for harm, which doesn't make much sense. So instead, I'm reading it from the verb natsah, which occurs numerous times with the phrases vacant of person, void of populace, vacant of wayfarer, void of wayfarer, whichever one you want to choose. This verb occurs with the same other words around it in numerous other places, particularly in Jeremiah. And the difference between them is one downward stroke. So if you look at the Hebrew there, you can see they are premeditated for harm and they are destroyed. The only difference is one little descending leg. So what I would argue is that we probably have a transmission error. At some point, someone wrote one thing and it was scrubbed out or erased, or they misread it for the other thing. And natsah means to ruin or destroy. Thus, destroyed are their cities, not premeditated for harm. And then we have this phrase, void of populace. This is a reuse of language from Zephaniah 2:5, but here it's much more emphatic. It's not just void of populace, it's vacant of person and void of populace. Destroyed are their cities. Whose cities? Probably some of those cities in the oracles of execration against the nations. I thought, if you would fear me and receive correction, I thought. Some of your translations, or most of your translations, will probably say, I said. However, this is interior monologue. This is not what the deity said, this is what the deity thought. It is short for to say in one's heart, or to say in one's mind, I thought, if you would fear me. And then we have this hypothetical situation introduced by the conditional statement if. And if you, the you is feminine singular. In other words, the city. The city in Hebrew is gendered as feminine. If you would fear me and receive correction. The same language occurred in the previous oracle. She receives not correction. Then her dwelling would not be eradicated by all whom I rightly set against her. Her dwelling. Here we have the feminine singular reference again, not the KJV's there. Her dwelling probably refers to the city. Some translations follow the Greek, which says from her eyes instead of her dwelling. So in the NRSV, you see, it will not lose sight. But I think the point of this is that her dwelling will be eradicated, just like their cities were destroyed. By all whom I rightly set against her. This is a notoriously difficult passage for interpreters. As we saw in Lecture 2, the verb pakad means to put an object in the proper place, position, or status. And when combined with that particle al, it has a negative status, meaning against. So it means to put object in the proper negative status, or to rightly set against. So the question is, whose status, place, or position is changing? Now, most of your Bibles will make it seem like it is the position of Israel that is changing. And most of the interpreters and commentators you read on this will make it seem as though this is talking about Israel. But I think it's talking about the nations. The nations are having their status changed now from being decimated by Yahweh to being set up by Yahweh as Jerusalem's decimator. So the position of the nations is changing with regard to Israel. So this is speaking, I think, not about Israel's status changing, but about the nations. By all whom I rightly set against her, her being Israel. Nevertheless, a continuation of contamination they made of all their affairs. A continuation of contamination they made. Literally, this phrase consists of two verbs in apposition that mean they rose up early and they contaminated. Rose up early modifies they contaminated. The sense is then eagerly or over and over they contaminated. And if you look at the Hebrew, you'll notice this amazing poetic alliteration. Hishkimu, hishchithu. So I think the alliteration helps provide emphasis to what this is really saying. They continually contaminated everything they did. And so I tried to capture that in my translation. Therefore, wait for me, all of you, prophecy of Yahweh, for the day I rise up for the catch. So here we have that oracular marker identifying the divine speaker. Remember, we saw in all the other places in Zephaniah, when we see prophecy of Yahweh inserted in there, it was the deity speaking, not the prophet. Therefore, wait for me, all of you. Suddenly, the oracle takes a turn. It's not addressing her anymore. Now it's addressing all of you, a collective audience. For the day I rise up. This is probably Yahweh's day, the day of the Lord. And we talked about that in our second session, right? The day of the Lord in ancient times seemed to refer to a sacred festival day devoted to sacrifice, worship, singing, and celebration. And then we also find this liturgical language drawn directly from the Psalms. Wait for me, for the day I rise up. These verbs, to wait for the rising up of the deity, normally in the Psalms have to do with waiting for God's deliverance. So you would think, and lots of people are led to think, that maybe this has a positive spin to it. Maybe this is saying something positive. But, as we just saw in the past verse, this is a response to a negative situation. She continually contaminated all that she did. And then we have this. For the day I rise up for the catch, or you could also translate that for the spoil. In other words, the deity is going to seize or catch his people as a despoiling army would. There is another way to translate that, and that is, for the day I rise up as a witness. So some translations may say as a witness. But Yahweh has already stood up as a witness to accuse or testify against these people numerous times already, hasn't he? I mean, we saw these threats of destruction throughout chapter 1. We saw that in chapter 2, the fate of all the surrounding nations were to be an example for Judah and Jerusalem. And an oracle of judgment begins this chapter. So what are they going to wait for now? Especially after all these sayings that it's imminent, it's coming, it's almost here, you're not going to have enough time. I don't think this is saying that, well, just wait a little bit longer and then I'll be a witness. I think this is saying wait for the fulfillment of the judgment that's about to come. Because my intent is for a mustering of nations, for a gathering of kingdoms, for pouring over them my scourge, all my fuming rage. And so here we have that poetic device that I referred to before as anaphora, that builds intensity with each succeeding repetition. For a mustering, for a gathering, for a pouring. And you have some wonderful parallelism. Nations parallel to kingdoms. Nothing much different there. They're synonymous expressions. And my scourge parallel to my fuming rage. In that case, the parallelism helps show you something more is going on here. Well, what is my scourge? Well, it relates to his fuming rage. This word intent here, because my intent is. Previously, this referred to Yahweh's demand toward Judah, which was to do what is right. Since his people are not interested in obeying, Yahweh's decision is now directed at the pagans, at the nations. And he charges them to gather and to assemble. That's those two verbs I got there, mustering and gathering. But it's not just gathering and assembling that's going on here. This is wartime assembly, which is why I did it mustering instead of just assembling. This is about Yahweh setting against Judah all those who are going to eradicate her, as seen in verse 7. For pouring over them my scourge, that is, for pouring over the people of Judah or Jerusalem. This is the same them who continually contaminated all their affairs. Scourge. The root of this word refers to inflicting harm upon someone. It's often linked to anger or indignation, and it may be spoken, as in a curse. It may be inflicted physically. When by my fervid fire the whole land will be consumed. These lines are taken from the conclusion of the second oracle of Yahweh's day, Zephaniah 1:18. The whole land, as in 1:18, this is not about the whole earth. This is about the whole land of Judah. The reuse of language here from way back there creates a literary framework for all the oracles of judgment and the oracles of execration so that they can fit inside of it. So we can expect that what comes next is going to be very different. So in conclusion, Yahweh has overthrown kingdoms, hoping that Judah would learn to fear him. But she only furthered her corrupt actions. So Yahweh has risen up against her to make her the spoil or catch of the nations. In other words, total destruction is coming, and there is no turning back. Time is up. And this happened. 586 or 587 BC, Judah was decimated by Babylon. Her people were taken as slaves, and her possessions were taken as spoil. And that ends the oracles of judgment and execration. And now we transition to the oracles of restoration. And this one I have titled The Oracle of Pagan Transformation. So I don't know if any of you were able to read that PDF I had on the website by Klaus Westermann called Oracles of Salvation. But he had a few things to say about things like these oracles here in Zephaniah. He says that such oracles are usually inserted after oracles of judgment as a supplement to them. He thinks that they were usually composed later than the oracles of judgment, when the prophecies of judgment had already been fulfilled. Much of this seems true of Zephaniah's oracles of restoration. The first oracle is usually not considered an oracle of restoration because it concerns the nations, which makes it rather unique. But it reflects the same idea that we saw in the Oracle of Diminished Majesties in 2:11. In other words, peoples all across the earth will show devotion to the God of Israel. This particular part of Zephaniah is often wrongly interpreted by Hebrew language enthusiasts, as we shall see. Yet I will then endow to pagans a lip purified. So we see that it begins with the voice of the deity. I will do this to them. Then the prophet's voice comes in to explain why Yahweh would do this, for collectively invoking Yahweh's name, for serving him shoulder to shoulder. And we see that it features anaphora when the prophet speaks, for collectively invoking, for serving. And it also has parallelism. Invoking is parallel to serving. Yahweh's name is parallel to him. Collectively is parallel to shoulder. It starts with this adversative key, and we've seen this a few times already now. When an oracle begins with this key, it helps serve as a textual link to link the new oracle with the oracles that came before. So this does the same thing, except it also introduces some significant differentiation, which is why I have translated it yet. Yet I will then endow to pagans. Literally, this means peoples or people groups. But in context, this is referring to people groups who serve gods other than Yahweh, right? In other words, these are non-Israelites, the same ones that were cursed in the oracles of execration. And then we have this fun phrase, a lip purified. Here we find an instance of synecdoche. Do you remember this when we were looking at synecdoche a little bit? This is when you reference the whole of something by naming one or more of its parts. So in this case, lip is a reference to a person's entire being. Another instance in the next oracle also involves organs of speech, but in that instance it's about the Israelites. In their mouth will not be found a tongue of deceit. The point of that is not to say, well, people are going to stop lying. Well, that's great, but ultimately this is not about transforming just what someone says or how they say it. This is about transforming their very being. They are going to be new people who don't lie because they are different. So having a lip purified refers to the person being transformed. Okay, I talked about that a little bit already. So what is happening to their lip? Here we have a passive participle, which could have a couple different meanings. In classical biblical Hebrew, this verb means to purify or purge, but it can also mean to polish or sharpen. In late biblical Hebrew, it means to choose or to select. Now remember, Zephaniah is not late biblical Hebrew. It is classical biblical Hebrew. So that leaves us with one of these two meanings, to purify, purge, or to polish or sharpen. And obviously it doesn't have to do with polishing or sharpening. So we're going with purify or purge. But what does it mean for one's lip to be purified? So to answer that, we're going to turn to a few things to look at what's going on when someone's lip is being purified. Isaiah's call vision in chapter 6 and in the broader ancient Near Eastern world. So Isaiah. Now, some of you may be familiar with what happens in Isaiah chapter 6. But Isaiah suddenly finds himself standing, I think, in the temple, or at least in a vision of the temple, and seeing a vision of God. And when he sees God, he laments because his lips are impure. He cries out, my translation, "Cursed me! Yes, I am ruined, because a man of impure lips am I." To remedy this situation, a winged serpent, or a seraph, takes a coal from the altar and touches it to his lips. It touched my mouth and said, "Look, this touched your lips, so that your iniquity may depart and your sin be covered over." So in other words, lip purification symbolizes the removal of sin. And then in ancient Mesopotamia, we have something called the Mis-Pi ritual, which refers to the cleansing of the mouth. This is a ritual of purification and transformation. It was usually done to the cult statue in a temple. Some craftsmen would create a statue of a god to put in a temple, and the last thing you would do would to wash the mouth of that statue in order to purify it from contamination so that the god could come into the statue and inhabit it. The ritual of washing the mouth or the lips of the statue animates the statue and enables communication between the human realm and that god. This ritual could also be performed on humans, on animals, or objects with an opening like a mouth. The point of purifying the lip or the mouth of something was to transform them for divine purpose or service. Yet I will then endow to pagans a lip purified. If you read the Aramaic version that Jews have used for a really long time, you will see that it doesn't say a lip purified, it says one chosen speech. Now you can see, instead of translating the verb purify, which we would expect from classical biblical Hebrew, the Aramaic version went with the later understanding of the verb, which is to choose or to select. And then it stuck this word one into the text as well. Why did it do that? Because it seems whoever translated this text into Aramaic wanted to create an illusion between this passage and the story of the Tower of Babylon in Genesis 11. The rabbis interpreted this as a return to the time when everyone spoke the same language, and they assumed that that language would be Hebrew. In other words, what I'm getting at, if you go on YouTube tonight and search for Zephaniah 3:9 or something like that, you're going to find endless videos of people saying, look what it says in Zephaniah. At the end of time, everyone's going to speak the holy language of Hebrew. There is no shared language in our text, in our Hebrew text, between Genesis 11, the story of the Tower of Babylon, and purifying a lip. This is something that's been added to it over the centuries, and people that really like Hebrew, like myself, have gone a little bit overboard with it and said, well, this is all about the language you speak. No, it's not about the language you speak. It's about who you are. It's about being transformed and changed. Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? And there I put it on my slide. This is about forgiveness and conversion. This is not about speaking Hebrew, as much as I like Hebrew. So, having been purified and transformed, the nations, like Isaiah, are now free, literally, for calling all of them on the name of Yahweh, and for serving him, literally, with one shoulder. In other words, to invoke Yahweh's name and to serve him united and in agreement. From across the rivers of Nubia, my supplicants will come. Lady Libya will convey my offering. So the voice of the deity finishes the oracle. From across the rivers of Nubia, and will convey my offering. The first line is a direct quotation from Isaiah 18:1. The last line draws language from Isaiah 18:7. There are, however, a few differences. In Isaiah 18:7, it says, my tribute, or my gift. Zephaniah gives it a more priestly or cultic sense by saying my offering. Why would he use a more priestly term instead of going with what was already in Isaiah? Maybe he was a priest. The verb in Isaiah 18:7 is marked as a passive to indicate how a gift will be brought. In other words, Isaiah 18:7 focuses on the gift, on the tribute, right? In Zephaniah, the verb is marked as an active to indicate how people will bring a gift. In other words, Zephaniah is concerned with the bearers of the gift. So, who are these bearers? We can start to look at that by looking at this phrase that I translated, my supplicants, or you could also translate that, my petitioners. How do you understand that? What's its relationship with the rest of the verse? Well, most people think that it is in apposition with what comes next. In other words, that my supplicants is referring to talking about the same kind of people that come up right next to it, right afterwards. So you see in the King James, my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed. But you'll see that I have translated it Lady Libya. So there is a confusion here, obviously, about how we're supposed to understand the Hebrew, Bath Putsai. It looks like it's saying the daughter of my dispersed ones, or the daughter of my scattered ones. In other words, the way the Hebrew is now, it looks like it's talking about scattered Israelites. But there are some major problems with this. First, it veers sharply from the context. This is about the restoration of foreigners, not about the restoration of Israelites. We haven't seen anything like that in this oracle so far. And the verb here is active. So why should Israelites bring offerings from Nubia? And maybe even more importantly, what are Israelites doing in Nubia? Well, again, we have the phrase daughter or lady X, which characteristically contains a place name. So we see in Zephaniah 3:14, exclaim, Lady Zion, whoop and holler wholeheartedly, Lady Jerusalem. So we would expect that if this says daughter or lady X, that it's referring to a place name like it does everywhere else in Scripture, not about a people group. And then we also have this, if we read it the way it looks like it's supposed to be read, it would be a cal passive participle, which I know doesn't make sense to you, but that would mean those who are scattered. And that phrase, that particular cal passive participle of this verb does not occur anywhere else at all. So when we take all this into consideration, the fact that this kind of phrase, those who are scattered or those who are dispersed, doesn't occur anywhere, that the phrase daughter or lady X almost always refers to a place, it seems quite likely that this should be understood as a place and that something else is going on here. So what is going on? My proposal is instead of reading Bath Putsai, we read Bath Put. Put seems to be the territory of Libya. Put and Cush, that is Nubia, are mentioned together all the time. The sound of T as in put and TS as in puts are phonetically similar. Sound very much alike. And then the ending is kind of weird. But if you look at the Hebrew, you'll see that the very next word begins with a yod. It looks like a little apostrophe mark on the end. So if the next word begins with what looks like that apostrophe, and this word ends with what looks like that apostrophe, it could be that that little apostrophe, that yod, has been added to the end of this phrase, bath putsai, on accident. It's a common scribal error that you see in texts all the time, actually, called ditography. So if we take off that I on the end, and if we slur our words a little, we can go from bath put to bath put. Bath puts, and then you tack that I on the end, and you go from Lady Libya to daughter of my dispersed ones. So, in conclusion, God will purify and transform the nations. They will turn to the God of Israel as in the oracle of diminished majesties, and we have two concrete examples provided, Libya and Nubia. But what this tells us about God is something a little bit different than we've been seeing from some of the other oracles. Yahweh doesn't want to destroy the nations. He wants them on his side. And in fact, Yahweh will be the God of all peoples. Question. Yes, many people are confused about the geography there. Because what we refer to as Libya, obviously back in that time period, wasn't exactly the same thing, right? But it seems like Put was located in that general region because, for example, many times in the Greek, when you find put referred to in the Hebrew, it will say, I think it's Libus in the Greek, which would be Libya. So we find that even in ancient times, they were associating this place called Put with the place Libya. All right, so now we've gone from the oracle of pagan transformation to the oracle of the transformation of Judah. 3:11 through 13. On that day, lady, you will have no reproach from all the affairs in which you defied me. On that day. So we see this common oracular phrase that begins it. We've seen this before. Previously, that day referred to Yahweh's day, or the day of the Lord, right? This was supposed to be a day of celebration, joy, and festivity, but the prophet subverted that language to indicate that it would be a day of doom and destruction. Now, that day has been transformed again. On that day, there will be restoration. Lady. If you look at the Hebrew, you can see that this oracle is addressed to a single feminine person, probably the city. And this is evident in the verbal forms and in the forms of you that are used. You will have no reproach. Usually translated, you will not be ashamed. But in an honor and shame society, shame is not a feeling or emotion. It is a social stigma. In other words, you will have no reproach refers to a change in the status of the people before their God. Previously, in 3:5, she ignored reproach. Now, she will have no reproach. Many translations seem to twist the meaning of this verse you have in the King James. In that day shalt thou not be ashamed for all thy doings wherein thou hast transgressed against me. But it is right and just that Israel should be ashamed for her defiance of God. That's not the point of this oracle. The point is Israel has now been changed. She has no reproach because the stigma has been removed from her. Because I will then remove from your presence the champions of your infamy. The singular noun here, infamy, when describing Yahweh has a positive sense, like majesty or exaltation. When describing objects like the sea, as in Psalm 46:4, it refers to swelling or surging. When describing humans, it always has a negative sense of like false majesty or ill-gotten prestige. And then the question is how to understand this word that I've translated, the champions. The noun here has either an active or a passive sense. Interpreters usually default to the active. These are the exalting ones. These are the triumphing ones. These are the celebrated ones. For the phrase's usage, we look to Isaiah 13:3, where the exact same Hebrew word occurs. I summoned my warriors in my fury, called either the celebrating ones or the celebrated ones of my majesty. Parallelism helps define the meaning. Warriors are known as celebrities, not as people that like to celebrate, right? I mean, maybe if they win, then they might celebrate, right? But what makes them renowned, what makes them warriors, is the fact that people exalt them, right? They're the triumphant ones, the ones that have conquered, not the ones that are triumphing. Warriors are exalted or celebrated. So, in other words, I think that this should be understood in a passive sense. I summoned my warriors in my fury, called the celebrated ones of my majesty. So who are the ones that are celebrated here in Zephaniah because of their infamy? It's kind of hard to say for sure. I think earlier oracles can help clarify this for us. Rulers, leaders, people of influence and or affluence, people like the princes, the priests, the prophets, the rich, the elites. I will then remove. They will be removed. This seems to indicate a future reality. So perhaps this oracle was written before Jerusalem actually fell. I will then remove from your presence. We have that thematic root again, to draw near, to approach, to present, to be present. And you will not continue to have contempt anymore for my sacred mount. Your translations will usually ignore the any more or the further there. I'm not sure why. Treating the sacred, like the sacred mount, with respect would be something very important for a priest, wouldn't it? Maybe it ends with people not showing contempt anymore for the sacred mount because Zephaniah might have been a priest. I don't know. And then we start getting to the end of the oracle here. I think the original oracle probably ended like this. I will cause to remain in your presence the people afflicted and powerless. They will not do wrong and will not speak a lie, since in their mouth will not be found a tongue of deceit. To me, it seems like a redactor has come and inserted a few things at the end here. So a brief review of redactors from Lecture 3. A redactor is a fancy term for an editor. It would have been a scribe in ancient times, probably the same one who collected and arranged all the oracles together into a prophetic text. So this is the form of the oracle that we see it now. I have color-coded the different parts of it to show you where I think the original oracle was in yellow and where the redacted parts are in red. So we'll look at that a little bit more in detail in a second here. Let's go back to what I think might be the original part of the oracle. I will cause to remain in your presence the people afflicted and powerless. So the question is, once the perpetrators of infamy have been removed, what remains? What remains is those people that were hunted by the lions, the princes, the people that were hunted by the wolves, the judges, the people led astray by priests and prophets, those who suffered under their error and injustice, those who were dominated by the oppressor. They will not do wrong. In other words, we see a transformation happening among these people from what we saw in 3:5. Where they ignored Yahweh's demand. One must not do wrong. But now they will not do wrong. Something has changed. And will not speak a lie, since in their mouth will not be found a tongue of deceit. So in the previous oracle of restoration, we saw that the pagans received a purified lip, which meant that they were cleansed from sin and restored for service towards the Israelite deity. Now, it makes sense, it should be Judah's turn, right? And so just here, in this oracle, as it was in the previous oracle, this is not about the words you speak or how you say your words. This is about the kind of person you are, right? This is about synecdoche. And then you have that thematic root. I will cause to remain in your presence. That thematic root now at the end applies to the people that had suffered. This is what I think the redactor adds. They will seek the protection of Yahweh's nature, the remnant of Israel. Yes, it is they who will graze and repose, since the intimidator has vanished. So first here you can see the shift in the voice. Yahweh was talking before. Now this is talking about Yahweh. They will seek the protection of Yahweh's nature. So now something has changed. And then we saw the same language from the previous redactions. Remember when we looked at those redactions in 2:7 and in 2:9? They all had this word remnant, which suddenly shows up here too. And then you find the insertion of a foreign idea that we found in the previous redaction, 2:7, where the returning exiles are likened to animals that are coming back and living in the land. They will seek the protection, but the intimidator has vanished. Before, this oracle was about removing certain people from Judah and transforming those who remained in Judah. So why would they need protection? Who would be their intimidator? Probably outside nations or enemies. So this part of the oracle presents a different problem now, that people outside might be a problem. They will seek the protection of Yahweh's nature, literally the name of Yahweh. In the ancient Near East, one's name referred to their character, their role, their essence, or their being. An appeal to the character of the Israelite deity seems to be what's going on here. A deity who judges the guilty and defends the innocent. So in other words, in Yahweh she now trusts, which is a complete reversal from what we saw in 3:2, where in Yahweh she trusts not. So why the insertions here? What do they add? Well, without these insertions, the oracle is solely about Israel. What about all those people outside Israel? The insertions add, they will have no fear of them anymore. And the added material actually works really well with the original material. For instance, that word remnant comes from the same root as those who remain, which was in the original oracle. So we find root play unifying the different parts of the oracle together. So in conclusion, she will be changed and transformed. Those who showed contempt of Yahweh will be removed. Those who suffered under them will remain, and they will rest securely under Yahweh's protection. So ultimately, Yahweh will bring transformation to all people groups. And that's the end of the oracles of restoration for today. What do you guys think? Next week is all about that. Next week is the final one. We will look at the rest of the oracles of restoration, and then we're going to sum up things that we've talked about already. We're going to talk about how does Jesus relate to Zephaniah? How does the New Testament relate to Zephaniah? How do we as people of faith work with this text that has all these crazy things going on in it? But yeah, just to summarize again, what is Zephaniah ultimately about? Zephaniah, I think, is ultimately about humanity not wanting to draw near to God, not wanting to be present with the deity, but the deity going into our situations in order to bring himself closer to us. And sometimes that closeness is to our disadvantage, and sometimes that closeness is to our advantage. Thank you.